Welcome to the Recovery 2.0 Beyond Addiction Conference. I'm your host, Tommy Rosen, and today I am so thrilled to be speaking with William Moyers. William is committed to eliminating barriers to recovery from addiction to alcohol and other drugs. As the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation's Vice President of Public Affairs and Community Relations, he has been at the forefront of national recovery advocacy efforts for more than 2 decades. From carrying the message about addiction, treatment, and recovery, to public policy and philanthropy, William brings a wealth of professional expertise and an intimate personal understanding to communities across the nation. He uses his own experience to highlight the power of addiction and the power of recovery. William, when I say it's a pleasure to have you here at Recovery 2.0, I really mean it. Thank you and welcome.
Well, thank you, Tommy. I've been following your work, your passion, and your expertise for a long, long time. But to have this opportunity to be with you is a real honor for me, professionally and personally.
Well, thank you. Let's jump right in. We have a lot of news in the media these days. I wanted to talk a little bit about our landscape of recovery today, as you see it. What are the ways that people actually can get recovery, can find recovery from drug addiction and alcoholism in the United States today?
Well, you're right, Tommy. And the good news is there are more avenues into recovery now than there probably ever have been. Just the work that you do espouses the reality that you can find recovery through meditation and through healthy living, wellness. You can find recovery through residential treatment or outpatient treatment. You can find recovery through those sort of traditional ways like a 12-step group, but through the use of medications and other things. There are a lot of avenues into recovery, and I would say that this is a very good time if you're one of those people out there who's struggling with this very bad problem, because there is not only help out there, but there's also a lot of hope.
And in your own personal experience, your path to recovery came through Hazelden itself?
It started there, Tommy, in 1989. I came out of a crack house in Harlem, New York, as a 30-year-old journalist who had started to casually use marijuana and alcohol as a teenager, and 15 years later found myself at the bottom, or what I thought was the bottom. And I came out of a crack house in New York City in 89 and came out to this place called Minnesota and went to treatment at Hazelden. But it didn't take. And some people say, well, then treatment didn't work for you, William. And I said, no, I didn't work treatment. I didn't work the recovery process. And so I returned to Hazelden a year later in 1991. Then I did stay abstinent. I emphasized that I stayed abstinent, but I don't say that I was in recovery, because as you and I know, and as so many of your followers know, there's more to recovery than just abstinence. And I did not use for a 3-year period in the early 90s. But you know what happens? It's like a shadow. It catches up to you. And I relapsed in 94, and I got sober and remained committed to recovery in Atlanta at a drug treatment center in 1994.
I actually had no idea that you went to Hazelden in 1989. That's the year that I went to Hazelden as well.
Well, we're fellow travelers. I did know that because I've read your webpage and so on, and I wonder if somehow we must have crossed paths during some part of that journey.
Yeah, I'm sure. And another point of contact is the fact, or similarity between us, is that in 1991, I got sober again, because I stayed sober for a year out of Hazelden, and then I relapsed for a year, and then finally got sober for the last time in 91. But I tell people that I was floating without a plan in early recovery. I didn't have much of a plan. And I tell people, if you don't have a plan in early recovery, then you definitely do have a plan.
Well, along that line too, and I talk about this in all of my public talks, because there's a lot of people, the lay public does not really understand what addiction is or what treatment is. A lot of people think that treatment is a cure. Well, as you and I know, there is no cure for addiction. There is a solution. We've been living it for a long time now. I would venture to say that we've both been in remission for a long time, but it's like any other chronic disease. And if you don't manage your chronic disease in recovery, we tend to relapse, or it tends to rear its ugly head again. And And I didn't really have a plan, in part because back in the late 80s and early 90s, I always thought that alcoholism was like being left-handed.
Hmm.
I'm left-handed and it's part of me. But what I didn't realize, Tommy, until I realized it relapsed in 94 and finally took seriously the fact that I didn't become an alcoholic. Alcoholism became me. And it permeated every cell in my body to the point that if I was going to recover from it, I couldn't view it as an appendage or as something that was over here. I had to view it as all of what I am, mind, body, and spirit. And that's how I began to recover finally.
And it's interesting from that perspective. In a sense, there's actually no room for shame in when you understand it like that.
Yes, but that shame remains like it was in 1989 for you and me, and like it was in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, and even probably back through the centuries when people were afflicted with this illness. There is so much personal shame around the inability for people like us to just say no. Why can't we just say no and get it? Well, it's because it's much more than just saying no. But until we come to understand that, and until we do a better job of explaining that to the public at large and to our policymakers, there is this shame that goes with it that, why can't I just quit? Why can't I just put it down and not crave it? Well, we know that it's far more complicated than that.
Well, it's been a while now that the American Medical Association has looked at addiction as a disease.
Yes.
And still there's this disconnect between public perception and public policy making and the fact that it's been declared and understood as a disease for some time now. Why is this not moving along quicker?
Well, in part because you and I are kind of impatient people, and I'm saying that somewhat facetiously.
I own that.
Yeah, but I am. That's one of my defects of character. I want it when I want it, and I want it now. And I remember when I got to Hazelden as an employee, and the CEO at the time, Jerry Spicer, said, "William, I want you to go out and change public policy around addiction." I said, "Yeah, sure, I'll be happy to do that." And he says, "And I want you to change public perception while you're at it." And I said, "Yeah, I'll be happy to do that. Can I have until tomorrow to get it done?" And it's not that easy. I mean, I've been doing it for almost 20 years at Hazelden now, and it's still a work in progress. I think, Tommy, the biggest challenge we face around this illness and moving people from the problem to the solution is this whole issue of shame that fosters stigma, or stigma that fosters shame. There is so much misunderstanding about what addiction is and what it isn't, and what kind of people it afflicts. Look, you and I we're showing up today. We're taking part in this conversation. We're going to share our experience with a lot of your followers, a lot of our followers at Hazelden Betty Ford. We look pretty good when we get sober, and when we dress up, and when we get back to work, and when we raise our families, and when we do all the things that we do, pay taxes and obey the law. But the public sees us as different than what we are. And one reason for that is because there is this sort of assumption that addiction afflicts bad people, or afflicts people who live under bridges, or afflicts people with who are other skin colors, or don't have an education, or aren't religious, or whatever. And I think one of the problems with the public perception is the fact that people like you and me and a lot of others don't do as much as we should to stand up and speak out and say, wait a minute. This is what addiction looks like, and this is what recovery looks like. Part of my shtick since I got to Hazelden in 1996 is to unmask the stigma of addiction and promote a greater public understanding of what it is and what it isn't. And of course, I wanted to do that all at once, and that's taken a long time. And we've made some great strides, but we have a long way to go. The point being that it's going to take people like you and me and our families to stand up and to speak out and to really sort of let people know what addiction is and what it isn't, and the reality that people do recover from this illness, and that when we do recover, we go back to being productive and healthy, and yoga instructors and recovery coaches and taxpayers and parents and all those things.
Yes, thank you so much for saying that. Now, one of the questions I have is with relation to the 12-step fellowships in general. And how they contribute to or take away from understanding or misunderstanding at the level of public perception of addiction. And so, on the one hand, you have this idea that we first of all need to remain anonymous at the level of press, radio, and film, as is written in the traditions of the original 12-step program, which is the program Alcoholics Anonymous. And of course, right this very moment, you and I are not being anonymous at the level of press, radio, and film. We're also we're not claiming membership or to any particular fellowship, but we are openly saying that we've had an experience with the 12 steps, and it's been a positive one, and it's resulted in a healing, a moving forward, a management of this condition we have called addiction. What happens if you and I and everyone else in the world, nobody ever said anything, we just remained anonymous and didn't share our stories to the outside world?
We'd be invisible, Tommy, and we would not be beacons of hope and help to people who don't have or haven't experienced what you and I and our families have. I mean, here's the reality about it, though. So far in our conversation today, I have not revealed how it is that I recover.
You know, William, as I look at my own experience, particularly over the last 2 years, I publicly launched a business called Recovery 2.0, which speaks openly about my experience with the 12 steps, that I employed the 12 steps in my life, that I was somebody who struggled with many forms of addiction, that the 12 steps were a significant factor in helping me move forward in my life. I don't talk about any particular fellowship. And as is written in our bylaws, in all of the fellowships, this idea of anonymity is very important, taken very seriously, that we need to remain anonymous at the level of press, radio, and film. And here, at least I'll speak for myself, in this moment, we're in a public forum, and I am expressing to you and to anyone who's watching that I've had a positive experience with the 12 steps, and I want people to know that there is a place, there is a way beyond addiction, and there's a way to manage it and a way to improve your life. My question is, have 12-step programs with their emphasis on anonymity been a hindrance in some way to moving forward in this conversation so that public perception of addiction can change?
It's a great question, and we could talk about that the whole time. And frankly, I'm not sure that we're ever going to get sort of a consensus among all of the fellowships of what's right and what's wrong, what's good or what's bad. The reality is this: I don't think it's the 12 steps that have hindered our ability to promote the reality that recovery happens. I think it has more to do with a misunderstanding among the fellowship about what anonymity means. Listen, anonymity is critical to protecting confidentiality in a 12-step meeting. Anonymity is critical to making sure that there are no public leaders of the 12 steps. Anonymity as a spiritual principle is also important, because what it does is sort of levels the playing fields and makes us all equals. On the other hand, anonymity, or how it's been misunderstood, has hindered our ability to mount a successful advocacy campaign in which many of our recovering members who are members of the 12 steps are willing to stand up and speak out without violating traditions. The reality is this: every day in my job at Hazelden Betty Ford, I stand up and speak out. I never do it as a member of a 12-step group, and I don't pretend to represent that group. What I do is stand up and say, my name is William Moyers, first name, last name. I'm an addict and alcoholic who is in long-term recovery because I got multiple chances to get well, and this is what I look like. And nowhere when I do that am I violating any tradition or the spirit of the tradition, which allows me to talk about my own experience without talking about your experience or without identifying other people. To your point, and I think this is really important what you just said, I do believe we need to go to the next step and talk about how it is that we do recover. And as you shared, your reality is you recover, among other things, in the 12 steps. And I have begun to talk more about that as well. Again, not speaking for Alcoholics Anonymous, not speaking as a member, or not pretending to represent, solely doing it because if I'm willing to speak in great graphic, gritty detail about my addiction, then I should be and I must be willing to talk about how it is that I recover from it with that same kind of detail.
Well, I think it's critically important, because if I'm an insurance company, or I'm a member of Congress, and I've got the interest of my constituency at heart, and I'm trying to figure out, all right, how do I move the needle here on this discussion with regards to addiction? If I don't know of a course that's actually going to work, if I'm not aware of a way to treat this condition that actually creates promising results, I'm sort of paralyzed. I'm not going to be able to do anything. I'm certainly not going to put my dollars and my votes and my time and energy behind the 12-step path or any other path of recovery, because if I'm not clear that it actually works and it brings about a result that I think is a good result, how am I going to act on this?
Well, that's right, Tommy. I'll tell you, I'm based in St. Paul, Minnesota. It's where I am today in our conversation. I do a lot of policy work at state houses around the country. One of the places I do it is the capital of Minnesota, which is St. Paul. I have a hard time, even all these years later, rallying the recovery community to show up at the Capitol to carry the message that treatment works and recovery is possible. I'll get maybe 100 people to come to meet their legislators on our Rally for Recovery Day at the State House of Minnesota. And yet 1 mile from the State House, I will attend a 12-step meeting in which there'll be 400 people on any given Monday night. Yeah. It's been very frustrating. All those 400 people are good people. All those 400 people want others to recover, but they still stay compartmentalized, or they still stay defined by their respect for and their misunderstanding of the tradition of anonymity, which in their mind says that they cannot go down to the State House and stand up and speak out, when in fact they can, as long as they don't do it as members of Alcoholics Anonymous or Cocaine Anonymous or Al-Anon or any other group.
Yes. I'm running an online coaching program right now. It's a 12-week program, and we're going through the Recovery 2.0 book and looking at some videos, and we're exploring these concepts. As I came to the 12-step part of the program, you would have thought I insulted the families of certain people in this program with the vitriol with which they came out and said, we thought Recovery 2.0 was something different. Here we are talking about the 12 steps. This is not everybody, but some of the voices in the program said, we've had negative experiences. We've come up against dogmatic approaches. We've come up against fundamentalism. It's very off-putting. Therefore, I really don't feel like these voices, we don't really feel like the 12 steps are right for us. We want something else. What do you say to somebody who's in that position?
Power to you. What I always look, until the 1930s, the late 30s, and particularly into the 40s, we know that Alcoholics Anonymous as a recovery program was birthed in about 1935 through the coincidental meeting of these two guys, a stockbroker with a gigantic ego from New York and a proctologist from Akron, Ohio, who had nothing in common except two things. One, they were born in Vermont, and two, they were alcoholics who could not get well until their cross passed. And they met each other, and they launched this thing. Thank goodness for Alcoholics Anonymous, because it is a program that has worked for millions and millions of American people all over the world since the late 1930s. It is a wonderful modality of recovery for a large number of people. But there are many pathways to recovery, as you know. And what I say to people is that whether you find it in church, or whether you find it in a 12-step meeting, or whether you find it on a yoga mat, or whether you find it in a sunset, as long as the recovery program that you find applicable to you treats you with dignity and respect and treats the whole person great. President Bush and I were in the Rose Garden together in 2001, and I went up to him and shook his hand, and I said, Mr. President, my name is William Moyers. I'm from Minnesota, and I'm a person in recovery. And without batting an eye, the president took my hand and he said, sounds like we have something in common. Well, we didn't have in common that we were born in the same state, because I was born in Texas and he wasn't. We don't have in common who we voted for in the election of 2000, because I know who he voted for and I know who I voted for. We didn't vote for the same person. But what the president relate to me on was the fact that we were both recovering from this seemingly hopeless condition. I know that the president recovers differently than I do in the sense of how he applies those principles. But the bottom line is that we both are recovering from this seemingly hopeless condition. And over the years of my travels, and I know you probably experienced it too in 2.0, there are lots of ways people get well. Wonderful, as long as it treats them with dignity and respect.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that message. I want to ask you about the current national policy landscape and the understanding, at least of this administration. Where are we at right now in the way our government views addiction and recovery?
Oh, Tommy, I could talk about that for an hour. I'd like to tell you that we've made some great strides because I think we have since the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. And certainly when I got to Hazelden in 1996 and was instructed to go out and change public policy around addiction, one of the focus of our efforts was to get insurance companies to stop discriminating against people who wanted to use their private health care insurance to access treatment. And up until 2008, insurance companies could discriminate without fear of violating the law. And so people like you and me who might want to use our insurance didn't get that chance. Well, we've changed that law. We finally changed that law in 2008. It took the Obama administration 5 years to put the teeth into that law. That was interestingly enough signed into law by President Bush. But that happened. And then through the Affordable Care Act, ACA, Obamacare, whatever you think about that as good policy or bad policy, the reality is that addiction treatment is covered in the basic benefit package. So we've made great strides. We've also made strides in the area of recognizing that treatment is a vital component as a public health issue, as addressing addiction as a public health issue. I think that's changed. The sad reality, though, is that we're still, as a nation, fighting a war on drugs, which is really a war against people like us. And the sad reality is that 2/3 of the federal drug budget and most state drug budgets go to interdiction and tough law enforcement, and not enough to prevention, treatment, and recovery resources. So we have a ways to go.
Yes. What do you work on a day-to-day basis in terms of this particular issue? I mean, I know you've been at this for 15, 18 years, and you've made a tremendous amount of progress. And I feel like, to underline what you just said, just the simple fact that we're now actually considering pushing people toward treatment rather than jail, big idea. I'm really behind it. What would be your dream, and I mean a realistic dream, for sort of the next 3 to 5 years as you look out? What could be accomplished? What would be a goal that you'd love to see take place that you think could be possible in the next short while here?
It's happening right in this conversation, because you and I are talking, and you're going to use this in your good work to reach out to thousands and thousands of people. The most important initiative that we as a collective entity can strive for in the next 3 to 5 years is to better educate people around the realities of addiction as an illness, the role that treatment plays, and the vital importance of resources for recovery on the backside of that. And nothing is more important, I think, than getting people like you and me and so many of our constituents at Hazelden Betty Ford, so many of yours in the work that you do, getting people to understand the importance of standing up and speaking out. It takes a long time to change law in this country, and you've seen, I mean, the public's attitudes towards Congress, towards government, are pretty low right now. And it doesn't matter whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. It's just there's a lot of dysfunction in Congress. There's a lot of dysfunction in state houses. Well, we can't sit around and wait for that dysfunction to go away. We don't have the time to do that. What you and I and the people who see this interview need to do is to recognize that change happens when we're willing to make change, not just in our own lives, but in the lives of those who don't have what we have. So standing up and speaking out at your church, participating in a rally for recovery at the State House, writing your member of Congress or your governor a letter and letting them know how important recovery is, sharing it with your followers, whether you're practicing yoga or whether you're in a book club or whether you're in a church group. What we can do in the next 3 to 5 years is to unmask this stigma by getting our faces and our voices out there in the general public. That's the most important thing. And I will tell you as well that my job at Hazelden Betty Ford has morphed over the years. I was hired as a public policy specialist. I became the vice president of public affairs for a while, which means I was running all of our government relations. But what's happened to me as I enter this next stage of my own recovery and in this next stage of what we're doing at Hazelden Betty Ford is I really the most important work that I do is to stand up and speak out in Rotary clubs and chambers of Congress and giving lectures at schools and writing op-eds and participating with you in 2.0. Getting the word out through my own experience is the most important thing I do, because whenever I do that, people come to me and say, William, can you help me, please?
I want to shift the conversation more to the personal now, and the level of the individual struggling with addiction. Many questions come to me on a daily basis. First, from a person who's actually struggling themselves. I am stuck in heroin addiction. Can you help me? What would you suggest that I do? For me, the first suggestion, oh, that's all right. Is it on a timer?
It's on a timer, but it just keeps turning off. But anyway,
Okay.
I'll just have to remember
That's
when you're
okay.
talking. Okay.
Yeah. Well, no worries. So I'm just going to start again.
Okay.
William, I want to shift the conversation now more to the personal, addressing some of the specific questions that come to me from people who are struggling with addictions of one kind or another. The first question has to do with primary treatment and getting care. Obviously, you work at Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation. I went to Hazelden back in the day, as did you. We've had positive experiences there. I'm assuming that we both advocate for primary treatment if you can get it. Would you say that that's a good first move?
If you can get it. I mean, the need for treatment far outstrips the resources to provide it. That's just the reality. That's going to take a long time to change. Like I said earlier, we spend billions and billions of dollars in this country on this war on drugs, and only a fraction of those billions goes to what you and I are living in our daily lives because of what we got through treatment. What I say to people, and I get 5 to 10 phone calls or email messages or Facebook messages a day from people who say, I saw you on Larry King Live, or I watched you on Tommy Rosen, or I saw that op-ed that you did, or I heard you speak at that school. Can you help me? I get queries all the time. And what I always say to people is that there's always hope, and never give up. But there's a fallacy with this illness, Tommy, that the only bottom, that you have to hit bottom before you can get it. No, you know why? Because the only bottom with this illness is death. And anything short of that is a way out. So if you're an addict or an alcoholic who says, well, I guess I'm only going to get better when I die, no, you're going to get better before that, hopefully. If you're a family member who says, well, my therapist says that my loved one has to hit bottom. No, don't let your loved one hit bottom, because then it's too late. The point being that if you're still struggling with addiction and you're alive today, there is hope. Now, you got to take that hope and you got to wed it to the services or the support that is needed. And that's a tricky piece. I get that. But there are a lot of avenues out there. Outpatient treatment is expanding dramatically in this country. In fact, that's the next sort of opportunity that we see at Hazelden Betty Ford, to expand our model into an outpatient setting so that people can access treatment at a far lower cost in their community without turning their whole lives upside down. I guess the message in closing would be that if you're struggling and you don't know what to do, there is always hope. And the most important thing you can do is reach out and ask for help.
Now, if primary treatment doesn't seem to be an avenue available to you for financial reasons or whatever the reasons might be, what would be another place that you would suggest a person go?
Well, outpatient treatment is residential treatment is the exception rather than the rule. From what I know of your story and what you know about my story, we were the exception to the rule in the sense that we got to go to a world-class facility in 89 or 91 and me in 94 in Atlanta and access residential treatment. But that's just really a fraction of the reality of today's world. Outpatient is expanding, and there are a lot of really good, affordable outpatient clinics or services in small towns and big cities all around the country. And because of the changes we've made in policy, insurance is covering outpatient treatment more than ever before. So if you have insurance, private insurance, if you work in a company, for example, and you're struggling or have a loved one who's struggling with addiction, your plan probably covers addiction treatment. Maybe it's only on an outpatient basis, but that's the way to go. The Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, for those who don't have any insurance. Like I said earlier, addiction is covered in that as well. My point is that if you are struggling with addiction and don't know what to do and you have insurance, use it. That said, there are a lot of people who don't have insurance, or whose insurance might not cover what they need. But there are a lot of other avenues. There's 12-step groups, there are recovery coaches out in communities. And the other thing that's so great is that we have the internet. And the internet is a way, if you use it the right way, in which you can find those resources in your community that are realistic and feasible as it relates to your reality.
Thank you so much. Another question that I'm getting from people are folks who actually have a loved one who's struggling. And it's this painful position to be in, to watch somebody else go down that road and not have anything, not have any power over their behavior. So I'm getting a lot of outcries. My husband, my mother, my father, my spouse, my brother, my sister, they're struggling in acute chronic addiction, methamphetamine, heroin, et cetera. What do I do? And my first piece of advice is, generally speaking, whatever you do, don't do it alone.
Right.
So can we talk to family members of people who are struggling?
Sure. Look, addiction is a family disease. It affects much more than just the alcoholic. The whole family is turned upside down. It gets sick, if you will, when the addict and the alcoholic is sick. So while you are focused on trying to help your loved one, it's important that you take care of yourself in that process too. If you're the spouse, if you're the grandparent, if you're the sibling of an addict and alcoholic, don't spend all of your energy on them at your own expense. You need to recover whether or not the addict, the alcoholic recovers. The second thing I would say is there's always hope. Don't give up. Keep that line of communication open. Addiction is a chronic disease, but it's very similar in its characteristics to chronic diseases like diabetes or hypertension or asthma. Where it's very different is in the reality that it causes behavioral outbursts or responses that are very different. You don't have a drive-by shooting over trying to get insulin, but you'll have a drive-by shooting over trying to get a hit of crack, or a robbery in a liquor store to get a pint of gin or whatever. So there are behavioral components to addiction that ravage not just the addict, but the addict's family and the community at large. So if you're the loved one of the family member, don't let the addict and the alcoholic run all over you or step all over you. But at the same time, keep that line of communication open so that if, God willing, the addict and the alcoholic is ready to ask for help, you're there to help them get to where they need to be. The last thing I would say, Tommy, is that you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. A lot of people who are addicts and alcoholics, no matter what their effort on the part of their family members, they're just not ready, and they just don't want to do it. That doesn't mean you give up on them, but what it means is that you take care of yourself while you, like I said, you keep that line of communication open and continue to encourage them to seek that help.
Can you put some words to this idea of keeping the door open for the person who's struggling, keeping a lifeline available for them if they should choose to take it?
Yes, I wrote a little book about 2 years ago called Now What? An Insider's Guide to Addiction and Redemption and Recovery. And there's a section of that book that's called 4 Steps to Sanity. And it was a 4 Steps to Sanity given to me by an incredibly successful CEO and corporate guy living in the South whose adult child continues to practice active addiction. And this guy is this CEO. He can do anything. Everything he touches turns to gold, it seems, until it comes to trying to get his own adult child better. So he's come up with these 4 steps to sanity. And one of the critical components of that 4 steps to sanity is what I talked about earlier, which is keeping that line of communication open. This father invites his adult child over for dinner every Sunday night. And sometimes the adult child comes and sometimes the adult child doesn't come, based on where that adult child is in their active addiction. But by keeping that lifeline open, that father has managed to keep that line of communication open so that when the adult child finally was ready to get well, he came over for dinner one Sunday night and said, "Dad, I need help." And since I wrote that in 2011, 2012, that adult child has done much better, though he hasn't stayed completely sober. So I think that the real message is that you can hate the disease of addiction, and you should hate the disease of addiction. But if you're a family member, you've got to remember to continue to love the person who has it.
So, William, I want to talk to you about this term, tough love.
Yes.
And I want to understand what your recommendations are for approaching a loved one. Now, you've just explained that you have to keep a lifeline open. You have to keep the door open. You have to keep a line open to the person who's suffering. You have to try to love them. Even though you may hate the disease, you got to remember to love the person. In recent years, I guess over the last several decades, the idea of intervention, one of the ideas that's come out of it is this idea of tough love, that obviously we have to set boundaries. How do we do that? Where does tough love fit into this whole picture? Can you give people some guidelines of how to approach a loved one who's really stuck in a chronic addiction?
Well, Tommy, you've touched on what's probably one of the most difficult questions to answer, and I'm not sure there is a stock answer to it. We all see it differently. I've never been keen on the term tough love. I don't know any love that's tough. Love is easy. Love is good. Love is all encompassing. On the other hand, it's very difficult, as you and I had talked earlier about the fact that when addicts and alcoholics are actively engaged in their illness, they hurt much more than just themselves, but those around them, and so it can be tough to love during active addiction. But I don't think that tough love means being mean or even tough to the sick person, because you got to remember that spouse, that child, that parent is sick. And if you were sick with addiction or sick with cancer or sick with diabetes or sick with hypertension, you wouldn't be tough on that sick person. You'd continue to love them. That said, as you inferred in your question and in our conversation today, family members, employers, communities need to make sure that while they continue to hate the illness, they love the person, but that love can include accountability. And we shouldn't let addicts and alcoholics step all over us when they're active in their use. As we talked earlier, you keep that line of communication open, but you set boundaries. You let that person know that you love them, but that you hate what's happening to them under the influence. You tell them that as part of your loving process, you want them to get help, and get help oftentimes includes accountability. So I would say to anybody out there who's struggling with the addict and the alcoholic, continue to love the person, hate the illness if you want to. But love includes accountability, and accountability includes honesty. And honesty means looking the addict and the alcoholic in the eye and saying, you know what, you're sick, I don't like it, and I want you to get well, and here's how you need to do it.
Now, what would you say to a parent who's dealing with a teenager that, for example, is exhibiting behaviors that are simply unacceptable to them in their home? So they may be stealing. They may be inebriated or using drugs and alcohol time after time again. And the parent has set a boundary and said, I will not stand for this. This can't happen underneath my roof. What's the next move there?
It's a tough one, man. It's when it comes to teenagers, it's even more difficult because parents do not only have a responsibility, but sort of have a legal influence, if you will, over their teenagers still before they come of age, 18 or in some cases 21. Parents need to set that expectation, make it clear, have a written contract, and if the addict and the alcoholic in their life, in this case the child, doesn't live by that, then you need to take the next steps, whether that means involving an interventionist, whether that means involving a family therapist, the legal system. Oftentimes, teenagers will find themselves in trouble with the law, and it's a really great opportunity, as difficult as it is, for the parents to go to the court, whether it be the prosecutor, the district attorney, the judge, and say, my child is sick with addiction, and as part of the process for holding them accountable, I would like you to please remand them or order them into treatment. It's hard to tell a child to leave the house, but if that child is old enough to be using substances, that child is old enough to be making decisions that have accountability with it. And so at the end of the day, in some cases, parents have to say to their daughter or their son or their grandchild, I can't have you living here if you're going to be under the influence, so please leave. Now, I always asterisk that by saying to the parents who are in this situation that when you ask your child to leave, tell them that there's another option and they can leave and go to treatment.
Thank you so much. Got to be one of the hardest things a parent could possibly face on this planet, I imagine.
Yeah, Tommy, I'll tell you, even since I wrote Broken almost 10 years ago now, and since I've written my other books, including Now What, I've had that own experience as a parent because I have 3 children who have grown of age, and they are the product to 2 alcoholics. Their mother and I are both addicted people who are in recovery, fortunately, but they're genetically predisposed to the ravages or the influences of mood and mind altering substances. And I have had to go through that same experience in my own family without getting into the details. That is never easy. And I'm a parent who has a lot of experience, professional and personal experience. So it's not easy. It's not easy.
Do you advocate for the parent or the family member that's suffering in this way? Do you advocate for attendance to, say, Al-Anon meetings and program? Do you advocate for therapy? How can a person not be alone going through this process?
Well, that's the operative word, alone. I mean, no addiction is a disease of isolation, and the antidote to it is togetherness, or the we of the 12 steps. The first word, the first step of the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous is what? It's we. And that's true for any 12-step program, including Al-Anon. Yes, addiction is a disease of isolation, and the way to recover from it and the way to get well or stay well is to hang out in the hood with other parents or other addicts or other alcoholics who are going through the process. And so whether, like we said earlier, whether your loved one wants to get well or not, you as a parent, or you as a spouse, or you as a sibling have a need and an obligation to get well in your own right. And so if your addict and alcoholic doesn't want to go to treatment, doesn't want to get well, that's no reason why you shouldn't get well. So go to meetings, seek therapy, find solace in church. There are all kinds of modalities to that togetherness that is the antidote to addiction.
Well, thank you so much, William. So I want people to be able to find, number one, your books and other works, blogs you may be putting out. Just how can people stay current with your work and also with the work of Hazelden?
Well, fortunately, the best way to stay current with my work is to follow people like you. I mean, because here you and I are, you're featuring me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of what you're doing in terms of Recovery 2.0. I can be found like you can be found on the internet. Broken, my book that came out in 2006, is still relevant. Hazelden Betty Ford is their website, includes a way to get to me. And if there's anybody out there who experiences this conversation that you and I have had today and they need help, I always remind them they can reach out to the Hazelden Betty Ford website and reach me. And also I remind them that it's never too late, man. And if you're struggling or you have somebody in your life that's struggling, it is okay to ask for help.
William, what an honor to talk with you. Thank you so much for lending your experience, your strength, your wisdom, your hope to this audience. I'm just looking forward to connecting in other ways down the road as well.
Thank you, Tommy, for including me in this important venue. Peace.
All right. Take care. Peace.